and why should you care? The simple answer to both of those questions is that it's all about expressing yourself. Not only does SDK3 enable one huge feature of Unity that we haven't been able to use until now, we now also have the action menu to control all of it. That means more hand gestures, more customization, and just overall more ways to express yourself than ever before. The big change that we have now is direct access to Unity's Animator Controllers. Walking and running, hand gestures, all of these are animation states that can be modified very easily, not just in what animation plays, but even how they transition among each other. Just to give you some examples of what you can achieve with SDK3, imagine being able to activate animations with a combination of hand gestures, or even just by speaking a word. It's actually difficult to list off all of what you can do because I'm still finding ways to do things that I didn't think were possible. Needless to say, SDK3 is a huge improvement in what avatars are capable of. Now that I hopefully have you all excited about what you might be able to do with SDK3, let's see if I can teach you a little bit about the key concepts. It won't be super in-depth, but it should be enough to get you started. Let's start with the Avatar Descriptor component. This is something that the SDK uses in order to figure out what your model looks like and how it should put together the animations on it. Some of you may already be familiar with this, but SDK3 does add a lot of new areas to fill out for new features and reduce problems that occurred with SDK2. If you're brand new to uploading avatars, this is what it looks like. And this is just a small sampling of it. To get started with it, this is the very top will be the view section. It's where you're going to tell VRChat where you put your eyes. And the only new thing here is that the edit button at the very right is a nice quality of life feature, and that allows you to actually drag the view position around in Unity. Lip sync is where you actually tell VRChat what movements to make when you do talk with your microphone active. You end up picking your mesh. You assign the visemes. It's all very simple. The first new section I'm going to talk about here is the eye look section. And that allows you to set up how your avatar's eyes work and how will you blink. At the very top are some personality sliders that will affect where your avatar will look and how often it moves its eyes. And I would play with these just a little bit, but the effects are relatively minor. Next is where you tell the SDK which bones are your eyes and how much they should rotate when looking up, down, left, right, and straight ahead. And finally, you have the eyelids, where you tell the SDK what you should do to blink. The next new section is the Playable Layers section. And I'm actually going to skip this for now, because the rest of the panel is about this section. And for the lower body section, this is something you're not likely to touch unless you own full body tracking and a VR treadmill, or you're looking to do something that's a little bit outside of the scope of this panel. Finally, the expression section is where you're going to set up your action menu and your avatar parameters, and I'll cover both of those shortly. Okay, now that we've talked about the rest of the descriptor, let's go back to those playable layers and the Animator Controller. As I said earlier, the Animator Controller is a huge change that SDK3 brought with it, but I'm going to start at the very top and introduce the layers first, and then we'll get into the Animator Controller. So here are the 5 playable layers. As you can see, I've separated them into the 4 transform layers and the 1 non-transform layer. And this distinction is important to make because while it isn't technically enforced per se, putting an animation on the wrong layer may have it act strangely or not work at all. Using the same controller in multiple layers can also cause problems, so please keep it to one layer per controller. So, just a short description on each of these. Starting with the base layer, which is where you put your locomotion animations like walking and running. This is a little bit more involved than it sounds, so if you don't touch this, I don't blame you. The additive layer is for animations you want to overlay onto your base animations like idle movements. However, this layer is a little bit special in that you can only animate humanoid bones. If you want to have an idle tail swish or an ear flick, you're going to want to put that onto the gesture layer. The gesture layer is also for movements relating to hand gestures. Mainly so that if you're not using a valve index, your fingers will still move and make the appropriate finger movements. You should also be putting anything related to the movement animations tied to hand gestures in here. And the action layer is for animations that will override all of the other layers, usually things like emotes. There's some special rules with this one, so I'd highly recommend taking a look at the SDK documents and using the example provided by the SDK to make sure your emotes don't accidentally wreck something. Finally, we have the only non-transform layer, the effects layer. And this is likely the layer that you'll work with the most, because it is the only layer where you should be putting animations that aren't transforms. If your animation moves blend shapes, swaps materials, fiddles with shader settings, or enables or disables an object, or anything else that isn't moving your avatar's bones, it must go in this layer. This might mean you have to split an animation into two parts in order for it to work properly. And it goes without saying, keeping your layers organized makes it much easier to work on and troubleshoot. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for, and I really do believe it deserves this much of an introduction because it really is that big of a thing. So without further ado, here is the Animator Controller. This one is actually relatively simple. All it does is control the addition and removal of some clothing, but that's the beauty of it. You can make some simple things with it, or you can do some really complex things with it. And with it being as approachable as this, I believe anybody can do this stuff. But let me actually describe what you're seeing here. So the technical way to describe an animator controller is that it's a set of layered state machines. And if you're not sure what that means, think of it like your avatar is going through a whole bunch of flowcharts at the same time just to figure out what animations should be playing. Each of these layers on the left is a single state machine or a single flowchart. And on the very right, you can see all of the things in that flowchart. Let me actually take a quick step back here, and we're going to start with actually a brand new layer. And the first thing you want to do when you create a new layer is you want to set its weight to 1. You do that by clicking on the gear, and that little menu will open up. This is important because setting the layer's weight to 1 means it will take the full effect of the animations in the layer. I can almost guarantee that everyone here has or will forget to do this at least once, including me. I have definitely forgotten to do it way more than I will admit. If you're 100% sure you got everything set up correctly and your animation still isn't playing, it's probably because you forgot to weight the layer. Now, we have 3 things here. We have the green entry, the red exit, and the blue any state. And every layer will start with these. The entry is where the flowchart begins. and the exit is where the flowchart ends and loops back to the entry. The any state is, I'll get to that in a moment. First, I'm going to right-click and create two empty states. You'll also notice that although I added two states, one is gray, but the other is orange, and connected to the entry point. The orange one is the default state. If there's an animation in here, it will always be the first thing to play. It's functionally the same as the gray one. Unity just highlights it for you so you know it's the default state. And finally, the any state object is special in that it counts as both of these states, or any other number of states that you happen to create. And that's for the purposes of transitioning away from it. Again, I'll get to that in a bit. But all a state really is a container for an animation. It doesn't have to contain an animation, but it usually does. Here's the inspector for the default state we made. And the main things you'll want to look at are the motion and the add behavior button down here. Motion is almost self-explanatory. It's where you're going to insert the animation that you want to play when it reaches this state. I haven't touched most of the other options, but if you figure out what you're doing with those, then by all means. However, I do want to touch on write defaults real quick, because as of the update very recently, just last week, VRChat no longer wants you to use this. It's turned on by default. It might not break anything if you leave it on, but the best practice for this is to turn it off. What that basically means is that if you animate something, you need to also make an animation that undoes the animation that you just did. If you have an animation in state that puts on a piece of clothing, you'll need to have an animation in state that takes it off, similar to our previous example. It's a little extra work, but it makes animating more explicit. And the last thing I want to cover here are the state behaviors, because these are pretty useful to know about and they're quite powerful. I don't want to spend too much time on these because they're somewhat advanced, but they are worth mentioning for further reading. There are 6 state behaviors that you can add. The Animator Layer Control allows you to change the weight of a layer in one of your Animator controllers. Weight is, I'm not going to cover weight too much more than this, but again, it basically affects how it affects your model, how the animations affect your model. The Animator Temporary Pose Space allows you to move your viewpoint to the head of your avatar. There are some restrictions with this, but it is something that can't be used to scale an avatar while it's being worn. If you do find out a way to do it though, please let me know. The Animator Locomotion Control allows you to turn off and on player movement, though you will still be able to move around your play space while you're in VR. The Avatar Parameter Driver allows you to change a parameter to a specified value, and that's useful for having 2 layers talk to each other if needed. And parameters are something I will get to in just a moment. The Playable Layer Control is the same as the Animator Layer Control, but allows you to change the weight of an entire playable layer all at once. And finally, this big boy down here at the bottom is the Animator Tracking Control. And what that allows you to do is disable or enable movement on parts of your avatar. Setting any of these to animation will lock their movement for the animation in the state. And you'll need to set them back to tracking in another state for them to become unlocked. Alright, we've got our states. Now we need a way to get around between them. So, let me just add some transitions here. Transitions are the gateway from one state to another. And theoretically, you can have as many transitions as you need. You can even have multiple transitions to and from the same 2 states. And that might seem weird, but you see why it might be useful very soon. So here's the inspector for the transition from our default state to our other state. And you'll see that it has options mainly relating to how the transition goes from one state to the other. Transition duration is, of course, how long it takes to get to the next state after the transition begins. The offset is how far into the destination state's animation it should transition to. Usually you'll want this at 0. Interruption source allows you to set something to interrupt the transition, and the one at the top that's enabled by default, has exit time, is the most important because that's actually a condition. You may have also noticed the conditions at the very bottom here as well. For a transition to begin, all of its conditions have to be met. For exit time, if the state has been playing its animation for at least the set percentage, with 1 being 100% of the animation, then it will allow the transition to begin. However, if there are other conditions that need to be met, all of the conditions need to be met at the same time in order to begin the transition. Now, you may be wondering, what kind of conditions can we make? And that's where parameters come in. Parameters are like a variable in programming. They consist of a name and a value, either an integer, a decimal number, or a Boolean, true or false. And conditions can look at and compare parameters with set values to figure out where they should begin, or when they should begin. Kind of like an if statement. And while we can provide some of our own custom parameters to work with, the ones you may end up working with the most are the ones provided by VRChat themselves. Here is a full list of all of the ones that we can access right now, and there's a few I do want to mention for being particularly useful or interesting. The viseme parameter displays a number based on which viseme your avatar is displaying at the moment, or what words how you're pronouncing the words. Gesture left and gesture right are there to tell you what gesture you're using with your hands, both the left and right hands respectively. Mute self actually becomes true if you've got yourself muted, and this is something that came with the update just last week. But I mean, all of these parameters are useful and interesting in some ways, so I would recommend checking out VRChat's documentation for them. I did also mention that you can have custom parameters, and how you add those is through the expression parameters object. It's something custom added by the SDK, so if you right-click in your project files, you'll find that under Create, then VRChat. And here's what it looks like. As you can see, you only get a maximum of 16 parameters in here, and you'll start with the very top 3, because they're used by the default emotes. Keep in mind that the names of the parameters in here and in your Animator controllers need to be exactly the same, even down to the capital letters. Now that we've got all the basic building blocks figured out, here's a bit of what a full example looks like. So we've got our 2 states here with animations in them, one to do the animation and one to reset the animation. I've connected them up with these transitions, and in this first transition I've got a condition that looks at the gesture right parameter to see if it's equal to 3, which is pointing. In the second transition, I've got a condition that looks to see if gesture right is not equal to 3, where it moves to the exit and then loops back to the entry and to our state where it resets the animation. And that's really all there is to it. Whenever I point, the animation will play. Whenever I stop pointing, the animation resets. And that's just the baseline of what Animator controllers are about. The interplay between parameters, transitions, and states, deciding what animations are playing on your avatar at any given time. There are some incredible things you can do with just that, And I don't have nearly enough time to get into some of the other concepts like layer weighting and blending, but hopefully I've given you a nice base level knowledge of the basics. The last thing to talk about is just the expression menu, or the action menu. This is also an object added by the SDK, and will generally be blank when you create one. Before you go about editing this, you'll want to attach both it and your expression parameters to your Avatar Descriptor first, because that will need to look at what parameters exist in order to modify them. There are 4 types of controls you can add to your action menu. You've got buttons, which quickly set parameter value, then return to 0. You have toggles, which set a parameter value, and then stay there until toggled off. Puppets have a few variants, but they all allow you to modify parameter values based on how you move your joystick and or where you touch your touchpad for the Vive users out there, or where you move your mouse for the desktop users out there. And submenus actually allow you to insert another expression menu inside of your menu. If your action menu gets to be a bit unwieldy, you may consider sorting the actions into submenus. All the options for your menu controls can only use parameters found in your expression parameters object, so again, make sure you do have that set up first. And that about wraps things up. I hope I've given you an adequate foundation that will allow you to create something amazing with Avatars 3.0. I want to thank you all for coming, and I hope you continue to have a great convention. If you do build something, I would absolutely love to see what you make. There's my Twitter and Discord respectively up here. And just to start that off, let me show you what I've made. Or rather, let me point out that my slideshow isn't actually part of the world. This is part of my avatar and made possible because of Avatars 3.0. Some special thanks I'd like to give out, starting with Kinix for helping out with getting the slideshow set up, and to Milo for allowing me to use some of their Griffin's bits and pieces as examples. Thank you very much.